Hello again, Free Play Florida. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. These days, a new company set up specifically to make video games is almost a daily occurrence, but it was not always so. Back in the early days of the video game industry, if anyone was making video games at all, it was the people that were making the hardware. Then in the late 70s, that started to change. Scott Adams and Adventure International did some pioneering work in the home computer field. But when it came to consoles, Activision blazed a trail and basically invented the whole third-party software business. We are very honoured, I know I am, very honoured to have three people that were absolutely key to Activision's creation and also their success. So can we have a huge Free Play Floridian, is that right? Welcome to David Crane, Garry Kitchen, Dan Kitchen. So, without further ado, I chose a slightly provocative title of how to take on Atari and win. So I thought a good way to start would be, so I'm going to start with you on my left here, Dan. When was the first time you saw one of these? And there's your weapon.
I'm sorry. I think 1977 when the machine came out. We saw one in a local store and got one that year.
So there was one at the Kitchen household.
Yes.
Okay, right.
Yes.
So any favourite games from back then?
I actually really enjoyed Canyon Bomber, Dave.
Oh,
that was a great one.
It's already becoming a love-in by the sound of it. Okay, right. What about you, Garry? You were obviously playing games on this. What about, was there any sense that you could one day make games for this?
No, there really wasn't. I thought the best game on it early on, all due respect to Mr. Crane, it was Space Invaders. I mean, that was the killer app. That's the thing that made the machine really start selling, was tremendously good adaptation of Space Invaders, I thought. But no, we didn't have our eye on making games on that machine. At the time, Dan and I were working on handheld electronic toys. Like, we worked on Bank Shot and Wildfire that were marketed by Parker Brothers. They had a 4-bit microprocessor. It was a similar process, but that's really where our focus was. And when that came out, and started to really take off, that changed our focus. And then at that point, we said, we should be doing something on that machine.
I'll come over to David then. David, same question. When was the first time you saw one of these machines? And maybe what was your reaction?
Well, I would have to say that I saw that unit on the first day of my job at Atari. And living in this apartment complex with tennis courts, I was playing tennis with Al Miller, who was one of my co-founders at Activision eventually. And one night after playing tennis, he handed me a sheet of paper and he said, "This is an ad that I wrote." He was working at Atari at the time. "And this is an ad I wrote. It's going out into the San Jose Mercury News tomorrow. Proofread it for me and, tell me if I can improve it." And I read the ad, and the ad was for video game programmers for Atari for their new Atari 2600 console that was coming out. And I read the ad, and I said, actually, this kind of looks like it might be fun. All right.
And it certainly proved so. Can you recall that interview? I mean, what did they see in you, and maybe what did you see in them?
Well, it was kind of a whirlwind. These days, you try to get a job anywhere, it takes 6 months and 57 interviews. In my case, that night I went back to National Semiconductor, where I was working as an engineer, and on a computer that I built from scratch and wrote a word processing program for, I wrote up a resume. I took that the next morning to Atari at 10 a.m. and had an interview. And I had spent a lot of time talking technology with Al Miller anyway, so he already knew what I was capable of. And so went back to my job, and at 2 o'clock that afternoon, I got a phone call that I had gotten a job at Atari. And I gave a 2-week notice. So in less than 24 hours from the time I read that ad, I was working at Atari.
Now, we alluded to Canyon Bomber being one of your early games that the Kitchen boys both enjoyed. You also did Outlaw. I just wanted to ask you, David, was there any frustration even in those early days that you were producing home versions of Atari coin-op games? Had you already got a kind of, I'd like to do something, from in here, from my ideas?
No, actually, I was having a lot of fun just making the Atari 2600 do things that its designers never intended for it to do. Outlaw was a training exercise. People have asked what kind of training I got to make video games, and the answer is I was told to sit down at that development system over there and make a game.
Learn by doing.
Exactly.
Okay, right. You're almost very famous for how you left Atari. So I'm now going to take you back to this whole bit where you realized that you and a couple of your friends seemed to be contributing a huge amount of Atari's revenue, and this got into a discussion with Ray Kassar, the boss then. Can you take us back to that moment where the boss looks you in the face and says, you are no more worth than the person putting together the cartridges? I just want you to tell us how you felt. Is that how it happened? I mean, has that just become a bit of a myth, or is that literally how it happened?
Well, spoiler alert, I mean, you took my punchline.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, but...
I'm really sorry.
Yeah, the marketing department at Atari circulated a memo. They had done a sales analysis of what their top sellers had been in the previous year, and they put out the top 20 sellers. And the gist of the memo was basically, look at how these games sold, do more that would be up at the top of the list than at the bottom of the list. That's not very helpful, but it also showed us that the four of us who ended up founding Activision had accounted for 60% of Atari's sales in the previous year, even though there were 30 plus people in the department. And it was an open secret that the previous year Atari had made $100 million selling video game cartridges. Okay. So the four of us were responsible for $60 million in revenues, and the top, many of the top selling games. So we said we want to talk to management and say, what this really demonstrates is you can be good at this, and we are, and we'd like to be compensated for it. Okay. And Ray Kassar had the corporate philosophy. He said, we're all just one big happy corporation, and if you create a product, there are other people involved in the product, and that's kind of what he said. He said, I realize you tell me that these games wouldn't exist if it wasn't for you, but the sales wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the people who put them together either. So it was his argument that it's a corporate proud project.
I'm going to ask you a question of that. I mean, you've actually made it far more diplomatic than I did, really. Had you actually got some sympathy with the point he was making?
No. Not when it, not. Not. Yeah. I have sympathy for products, but not for creative products. I mean, that was really our point. Is if there's a lot of creation that goes into this, it makes a difference. If you make a creative product and it sells really well because of the creativity you put into it, then that's what we'd like to be recognized for.
Okay. David, I need to stick with you just for this one, and then we'll come on to the lovely Kitchen Boys in a second. So first of all, thank you to the wonderful website Dot Eaters, where you can find a mind of classic pictures and info. Dot Eaters, it's at the top there. Yes, so that's David, if you didn't know, that's David on the second from the left there. I understand that your first job when you left Activision was to actually reverse engine a VCS. How do you go about doing that?
Well, if you're going to reverse engineer a piece of hardware, you basically treat it like a black box. It's got inputs, and you manipulate the inputs and see what happens to the outputs. And you do that over and over and over again and exhaustively until you figure out what the machine is capable of doing. Then you test your hypothesis, which is the step that a lot of people don't realize is you can't reverse engineer something just on paper because you have no idea whether what you figured out was true. Yeah. So I also then started writing software that manipulated them at real time to prove that what I figured out was in fact the case. This does this, that does that, and from that, I was able to build a development system and start making games for Activision.
Now, you make that sound easy. It obviously wasn't easy. But I'm particularly interested that overshadowing all this is you've got the threat from Atari to, I don't know, I'm British, so we're not very litigious, so to sue you, to shoot you, something bad was going to happen to you. So I just want to know, we're all clever in hindsight, right? But at the time, how worried were you that Atari was going to stop this before you'd even begun?
Actually, not the least bit worried. We founded the company with venture capital backing. It was one of the first companies in the history of the world to be venture capital backed for software. Which is really what we were doing. I mean, we did have to make cartridges, but we weren't making a widget as much as we were creating software. And that's kind of a hard sell to venture capital because they said, wait a minute, that means your assets walk out the door every night at 5 p.m., right? Yeah. The creators. But anyway, so we raised money through venture capital, and we had a budget to defend the anticipated lawsuit from Activision. From Atari. We also hired the best patent lawyer in the Bay Area and asked him the question, and if you ever ask a lawyer, is this going to be a problem, you know, can you defend this? They usually say, I can make a case for that, or I can make a case for that, and yeah, maybe, you know, probably a 40% chance of losing, but it's okay, you know. And he came back and he said, I can absolutely 100% guarantee you this is not a problem.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've never had that before.
And he was right. And he was right. That must have been a help. In 1980, your first 4 games are released. They are Dragster, which we're going to play later, Fishing Derby, Checkers, and Boxing. I was quite intrigued how you came up with those 4. Did you say we need a range? I was also intrigued why you didn't have, like, a space shooter, which, as the boys have pointed out, were pretty big in the arcade at the time. So I just wondered how you came up with those 4.
Well, at that time, I don't think there were a lot of space shooters. I mean, there was Space Race and Space Invaders wasn't in 1979.
No. Yeah,
Was it?
Well, it was actually, yeah. And it came out on the Atari in 1980. Sorry, this is not part of the quiz. Right, okay. But I was just
anyway,
intrigued. But why did you come up with those 4? They're an interesting mix.
Simple fact is, we made games that we wanted to play. That's actually why they were so widely accepted. We had a group of 4 people with very diverse interests, and we kind of made sure before we put out a game that everybody liked it. And if we had to make changes to make it so that everybody liked it, we would. And that kind of guaranteed that it was going to have a wide market appeal. And there's a lot of technical aspects in there that were fun. The Dragster, just making Dragster happen on the Atari 2600 was one of the hardest things that had ever been done on the Atari 2600, and that was fun. So yeah, it's just really, we were basically making games that we wanted to play, and that turned out to be a good strategy.
It certainly did. And as don't think that you two have got away with the old photos, by the way. So it certainly seemed to go down well because, so we've got here, if you can see, so it's Dan on the second from the left, Gary in the middle. The first question I want to ask is that were you in a moustache growing competition at this stage?
Absolutely.
Our father had one.
So, okay.
Seemed like the right thing to do.
It was required.
It was good. You're looking great there, boys. Okay, so my question, perhaps Dan first, is that, well, so how did you come to work for Activision?
Well, we were working, Gary and I were working at the company that created the handheld games. Yeah. And we had a system there. Notably, the first game we were looking at from Activision was skiing. Oh. We just were amazed at how beautiful it was compared to the Atari games. And so Gary took an interest in the machine and actually did what Dave was doing on the West Coast. Gary reverse engineered the system to learn the system and create his first game, which was Space Jockey. And from that, I had learned from Gary how the machine worked. And we inevitably left that small company, where we had a small company in Gary's basement, and where he wrote Donkey Kong. And the funny story is, at that point, Activision cartridges had a catalog in the back with all 4 of the designers on there. And we were working with 2 chaps, the ones in the photo on the ends, with Gary and I in his basement. And Gary at one point took out the catalog and drew our pictures over the 4 founders and stuck it up on a wall and said, one day we're going to be those guys.
And look at you now.
And inevitably, we from Gary's work at Space Jockey and Donkey Kong, met with Activision at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas in 1981, I believe it was, or 1980.
Go on, Gary.
Um,
Pick up the story, Gary.
2 or 3?
by the way, on the right is John Van Rizen,
Yes.
who everybody knows did Hero, which is
An incredible
really
game.
one of the best games ever on the machine, and it doesn't get to do because it came out late in the process. Yeah, we really liked Activision. We liked the quality of the games. I picked up the phone one day and called them. I called the main number. I said, I want to speak to somebody in product development. And I bounced around in extensions for 20 minutes till I got a guy. And I said, we do Atari 2600 games. And he said, no. He said, we know everybody who does Atari 2600 games. And I said, oh, okay, hold on. I just got to finish working on Donkey Kong for Coleco. And he said, where are you? I'll be there tomorrow. So he came out and visited us. It was Jim Levy, Dave's co-founder, and Tom Lopez, the head of development. They came out. They met with us, invited us to California. We flew out, and we joined in time for Consumer Electronics Show, June 1982.
So that's early doors. I want to know that then, how did you, some of your games, Keystone Capers and Pressure Cooker, which we're going to play later, Gary, how, it sounds like they were very open to, how can I say it, off-the-wall kind of ideas. Did you actually sort of have to pitch these really interesting but unusual ideas to them?
No, that's why we joined.
Okay,
Activision.
right.
We were at the same time being courted by Atari. Atari flew us out first class, put up a fancy hotel, bought us a wonderful dinner, and said, you don't want to go to those upstarts. You want to go to the guys that built the industry. Well, then we went to Activision, and Activision, it was very clear that the designers had the say of what games they were doing. Right. In fact, one of the first times we went to Activision, I said, I'm here to see David Crane. This was actually after we had started. I said, well, I'm going to go over and see Dave. And I said, where is he? He said, oh, that's the door to the lab, and it was locked. And I said, well, how do I get in there? And they said, well, you don't. People don't go in the lab. We leave those guys alone. They do whatever the hell they want. And when they come out and say a game's done, we put it out. And that was very appealing to us. So we didn't have to ask anybody what games we were going to do. Didn't have some MBA calling me up and saying, we want a game with a clown riding on a unicycle. It was
Keystone Cop.
you do your games, make them great, and we'll leave you alone. That's why we joined.
Can I ask you both one as well? That's wonderful. Creative freedom, I can definitely see why you went for that. Can I ask, particularly when you gave us that lovely image of you putting your heads on the founders one, is it the fact that they would credit you as authors, unlike Atari, was that important, either of you, was that important too, that you would get acknowledgement?
Well, the reason the faces happened was nothing more than the fact that we respected the fact that they were doing the best games. And we had the same belief in quality, and we said, well, these guys are doing the best games. We want to do the best games. It wasn't really so much, I think, about recognition, though obviously we recognize the importance of just like an author of a book or a musician. You want people to know who did the work.
Right. It was more that we were incredibly impressed with the work Activision was doing, and we felt in the games that we were doing on the Apple II at the time and in the handheld field, we were doing the best games in those genres for what they were, and we just wanted to work with a company that had the highest quality games.
That's
So
beautiful.
on the subject of Activision's creative games and looking at them from the outside, when Manny Gerard, chairman of Warner Brothers, took you up to their 50th floor penthouse office with the big window and offered you tons of money to go work for Atari, what did you tell him?
Gee, I don't know if I recall that story.
I recall that story, Gary.
So anyway, Activision and Atari both kept calling and saying, who are you guys going to join? They loved the fact that we had a ready-made studio. We had 5 guys, and we were ready to go, and I just finished Donkey Kong. You guys can obviously do this, so we want to hire you. And we called Activision and said, we're joining Activision. I mean, wasn't about the money, wasn't about royalty, no royalty.
No-brainer.
It was, we want to do great games. So I got a call immediately after when I called Atari and said, sorry, I got a call from Steve Mayer, who was one of the big Atari guys. And he said, "Are you around tomorrow?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, I'm flying out to New Jersey." We were in New Jersey. And he flew out, pulled up in a limo, said, "Get in the car." So he took me into New York City to the Time Warner building. And we went in and went up to the top floor of the Time Warner building. And Manny Gerard was the executive at Time Warner who was in charge of their company they owned, Atari. And he walked me in to Manny Gerard. And I was supposed to be duly impressed and duly intimidated, and I was both. And his office was about the size of this room, maybe a little bigger. And way at the other end, Manny's at this desk, and he walks me in, and we sit down, and Manny says, "Steve tells me we have to have you guys, and I understand that you're going to try to go to Activision. What do you want? Whatever it takes."
Really?
Whatever it takes. You name the number. And, you know, I'm a little more seasoned now than I was back then. And to really convince you how important quality of product was over handing me $1 million check. No, I didn't have the other guys with me. They were money. You know, but I was being idealistic. I said, "Look, I got to be honest with you, Mr. Gerard." I said, "That Pac-Man game just came out. I can't work for a company to put out a piece of shit like that."
Wow. Can I
I
say,
remember that story.
balls of steel, this one.
Of steel.
And I was out of that room in the limo and back in New Jersey in the flash of an eye.
That's fantastic. I'm going to come over, David, can I come over to you now? That is an impressive story. Is that, I've a lovely picture here from your Santa Clara offices in, I think, around circa 1982.
Is that Scott Boulevard?
Yeah, I think so.
I think it is, yeah.
The question I want to ask is, everyone knows how good your games were. We played them, we knew, and obviously you knew.
Yeah,
and
we
Joe-
knew,
But I
yes.
just want, David, I want to take it a slightly different angle. On this picture, you'll see the very distinctive Activision logo. And of course, Activision, they really stood out on the shelves. I want to ask you, do you think it was just the fact that you made great games you did? Or do you think that the way you marketed them actually had something to do with the success?
Well, of course, it was everything. The quality of the game matters once you get it home, but you have to get it home for that to matter. Yeah. And Jim Levy was a marketing genius, and at the time, you know, he was in charge of everything on the business side, and for a while doing all the marketing as well. And you'll see a lot of things in the Activision cartridges that are his influence, and some that are ours. One of the things that we hated when we were at Atari is the way both the box art and the cartridge art, label art, and even the manuals misrepresent the games. My favorite, I don't even know if this is true, but it's the way I remember it, is the game Breakout.
No, it is true.
It's true. Have you checked it?
I've checked it. It's true.
The game Breakout, and everybody knows what the game Breakout is. It's a Pong game where you're knocking out bricks, right? The manual description of the game starts, you're flying through space and you encounter a multicolored force field.
Okay, right, yeah.
All right. And, you know, that kind of thing just pissed us off. So we went into Levy very early on and we said, you know this box art you're talking about trying to do? We want this box art to absolutely perfectly pixel by pixel represent what's on the game. Don't sell the customer a pig in a poke. We want to be able to, the customer to see, the consumer to see what they're going to get.
I like that because there's some confidence, because back there, you know, you were working with primitive pixels, but that kind of shows the confidence you had in everyone's ability.
Yeah, well, yes, it was. And then he looked at us and said, no.
Okay.
That's why he was the marketing genius.
That's right.
Yeah, okay.
And if you look at the cartridge today, the Dragster,
Yeah.
the agreement was basically there will be a stylized version of the screen on the cartridge and on the back of the box, so that when a person is interested enough to look, they're not going to be misled. They're going to see what the game looks like. But he said you can't have the front of the box not have some, you know, attractive image with stylized imagery, and you know, you see that in all the boxes. They're very attractive. Another meeting, I'm sitting there in Jim's office, and he looks up, he points up to the shelf of Atari's line of games that he had on his shelf, right? And he said, look at that. He said, you realize that there's no brand consistency? Every game, the spine of every game is different. They use different fonts. They use different this. They use different that. And he said, I want the Activision games to have a common brand look. And so if you stack all your Activision games up along the side, you will see, very similar. You can glance at it and say, this is an Activision game. So there was a lot of that level of marketing going on that got the games into the consumers' hands so that they could find out they were great games.
Just to defend Atari for one quick thing. You were saying that at Atari they didn't do that. Well, Atari wanted to put the picture of the game on the label, but they couldn't figure out how to make the label flicker. so they couldn't do it.
Hey.
That's true. That's a true story, actually.
We'll be here all week.
That is true story.
Going back to
Thank you.
a little bit of our meeting with Atari, as I recall, I think this happened when we were being toured around Atari. I believe afterward we went into one of the VP's offices, and he started out the meeting with us sitting there after viewing the lab and wanting to coach us to come. He started saying, well, you guys are, you're not that special. I can get towel designers to do what you guys do. And that kind of made it realize that we weren't interested in working for a company that didn't value creativity.
Well, it was brilliant, David, that you pointed out the box art there because you can see
there
a
it
row
is.
of them.
Yeah,
You can see a row of
there you
them
go.
So this is Dan and Garry. Can I just say, it looks as though that the moustache growing competition has ended in a tie, I would say there. So well done, both of you. I would like to ask you about that whole thing you were buying into, the Activision thing. Everyone seems to make a real effort. There was challenges for games. There was badges you could win. There was this idea of creating a community. Can I ask, Dan, if you want to start, Garry, how important do you think that
Well,
was?
wait, before we get to that,
Yeah.
just because Jim Levy and Tom Lopez flew out and talked these guys into joining the company, we weren't going to let them join the company until we got to talk to them.
Oh, right.
Well, that's true.
Right?
That is
Yes.
true, yes.
So you came out and met with all the designers, right?
Yeah, we came out, Dan and I came out, and we were much more intimidated meeting Dave Crane than we were meeting Manny Gerard. So we came out, and they put us in a conference room, and we walk in, and there's a machine exactly like this with a couple of carts sitting there, and Al Miller and
Bob.
Dave. I don't think
No,
Bob
no.
was there. It was
No,
just
it was Al and
Dave.
Dave, you're right.
And it was me and Dan. And we sat down, and we were scared to death because these guys were icons, And the great story is Al, we talked a little about this and that and designing and code and all this, and then Al took this game that he had just done called ice hockey. It was a two-player face head-to-head, and he goes, "You want to play?" And he plugged it in, and Dan has always been the better gamer of the two of us. So I slid the control over Dan, and I said, "Dan, you're on." And Dan beat the designer at the conference table.
Was that the right thing to do, Dan?
Well,
It was, because it showed that we had skills.
I had a particular move that I could get the puck in from behind the net, and I did it the first time. He looked up and said, "What the hell was that?"
He goes, "What did you just do?" Anyway.
And I repeated it a few times and beat him, and I think that may have solidified in Al's mind that we were good enough.
Yeah, you're hired now. You can beat us at the game.
I'll use that as a way in. That's a lovely story. So it's clearly that they'd recognised that you were gamers and you were fun people.
Yes.
Can I? Was that clear that this was a fun place to work? We hear about Atari and the hot tubs and all that stuff. I'm not saying did you ever have a hot tub with David Crane, but did you ever have a hot tub with David Crane?
There is a confidentiality agreement.
Okay, right. Yeah, so I should have checked the small print. But God, was it a fun place to work, or how was the balance between work and pleasure?
I'll tell you my vision of the difference between the two, all right? So this is the type of people we are. Years later, Dave and I worked on a project together, and this was in Activision. We were now at Absolute Entertainment, and we did a project called The Boy and His Blob, if you guys know it. And Dave and I...
You get a round of applause for that game. That's
Yes.
impressive, isn't it? Right?
It was one of Dave and I's many collaborations, and Dan was involved as well. But Dave and I spent many, many late nights working on that game, and we normally didn't collaborate together because we were on opposite coasts, so it was all remote. But this time, Dave came out for 6 weeks, stayed down the street from the office, and we worked literally 20 hours a day. And this is the example of the difference between the hot tubbing and the drugs and everything else that you hear at Atari. We had a particularly bad bug in A Boy and His Blob, and we worked and worked and worked until we were dying, and we finally found it. And I think we got like 20 hours straight trying to find this bug. And to celebrate, the Atari guys would have gone out and, you know. So we went to my favorite pizza place, ate a whole pizza, like each, and then went and had ice cream. And that was us really going wild.
Rock and roll.
We were going
back
wild
in the
with that.
day.
And,
Okay.
and that was that's the difference between us and that.
Beautiful. Now, we've talked about the good times. I thought I'd better bring it down a bit. And I'm going to go to David first for this one. Is that everything
good
seems
Lord.
to be going well, and then, there seems to be, should we say, glitch in the market. David, at what point were you aware that something was up in this previously very lucrative video game market? And what do you think was causing it?
Activision caused it.
Whoa, you've heard it here first. Go on, tell us.
Yeah. I mean, basically, Activision was this upstart company and proved that you could make video games for someone else's console. Now, of course, we had to fight the lawsuit and all the other things that we had to do. And we also had four of the best game creators on the planet that made it possible. But that's not what people saw. What people saw is all you have to do is start a company and take a little venture capital funding and throw a bunch of programmers into a lab and say make games. And we used to go to CES twice a year, January and June. And the June show got turned into E3. But this was still back when there were two CESs. And one CES, I'm going to guess it was June, the program came out that showed all the companies. And there were 3 video game companies that June, which was Atari, Activision, and Imagic, I think, at that point. The next show, 6 months later, there were 30.
Right. Okay.
So 30 companies started up to make video games, and they didn't have talented designers. They didn't have anything. They didn't have anything they really needed to make that happen. And when we saw that, we looked at that, and I said, quote, none of these companies are going to be in business a year from now. And I didn't realize what that was going to mean to the video game business.
You did have a plan B. Is that you moved away from just producing cartridges. You didn't just produce them for the VCS, but you moved away from that into the kind of home market. So again, I'm going to stick with David and then I'm going to come to you boys. Is that, was that an easy transition going from consoles to computers? Was it something you relished or something that was just forced upon you?
You don't start a company without a long-term plan. So our business plan said that we were going to start doing Atari 2600 video games because there were 26 million Atari game consoles installed base. And actually, it was 6 million at that time, but it was still enough to support a market. And 5 years from that point, we were going to be transitioning into the home computer market, which, I mean, the Apple was out there, and the computers were out there, but they were very slow, on the uptake, on selling into the system and becoming useful in the home and that sort of thing. So we gave it about 5 years that there would be a viable market for home computer software. We'd want to do entertainment software on the home computers, but at least there's a different market out there. So we literally had a business plan that said for 5 years we're going to be making Atari 2600 games, and there's going to be a growth in video games, and the video game growth will start to fall off, and then the home computers slowly growing up are going to cross. And at 5 years we had this crossing point of where now it makes sense to concentrate more on the home computer than on the video game.
This is very prescient. If I can you manage my share portfolio? You've seen in it? If I had one. Can I just ask you one more thing about home computers, and then I'll come to you boys? Is that you said that it was a long-term plan. In that case, were you quite excited? Because, of course, I vaguely know how incredibly limited and how incredibly difficult it is to code this. As soon as you start getting into the Commodore 64 and Atari home computers, was it like, great, now we can really start exploring the ideas that we've already had, but we've just not had the machine to make them work?
Not really. I mean, those machines, even as home computers, were somewhat primitive. We had to use tricks on every one of them until you finally got to the PlayStation. You couldn't just design a game that could be anything to anyone. But the other thing about this ramp I was talking about is it showed video games. I'm going to reverse it and start with time over here and coming that way for the audience. But it showed the video games coming up and then starting back down. And like I said, the home computer slowly ramping up. And here was this point about 5 years out that we expected to be. We ended up at that exact spot 5 years out. What we didn't actually predict is this video game thing went this. And then crashing down, and yet it ended up at the same place we thought it was going to be. And yet now everybody's thinking, oh my God, it's a crash. And video games are gone forever because of this, precipitous drop. When in actuality, it was pretty much the natural transition. We just didn't realize that the thing was going to go through the roof for those first 5 years.
While we're sticking on the home computer area, Gary, I'm going to come to you. This I find fascinating, okay, is that you previously worked on some software that actually put the power of making games into players' hands. I believe you'd worked on Designer's Pencil. I think I'm getting this right.
Yep.
So tell us about this, Garry Kitchen's Game Maker. Tell us about the impetus, because, again, this is prescient stuff.
Well, we were doing games, and then Activision was finding, I think Dave would agree, that on the 2600, it was Atari and Activision and Magic, and then a bunch of upstarts who weren't doing great games. So we had a pretty large part of a really big market when it was healthy. You went into computers, there were a lot of people doing computer software, so it was much more competitive. Activision didn't have the name in computer software, and it was much harder, much more competitive. So you saw that line of products you launched on the previous slide. They didn't do the numbers that the VCS stuff was doing, and the company was suffering financially. So I remember a specific meeting when Tom Lopez came out and said, look, not only around computers, but we got to think differently. We got to do creative stuff. It doesn't just have to be games. Do something that really takes advantage of the computer, even if it's not a game. Think creativity. And the reason he was saying that is I think that Print Shop from Broderbund had sold a ton of units. So good corporate boy, I thought creatively. And I had always wanted to do a computer language that controlled a pen moving around on a piece of paper. I thought it would be cool. So I did Designer's Pencil, and it was reviewed very well, but didn't sell that well because people didn't understand what it was. But a lot of people who did like Designer's Pencil said to me, it's cool, you gave us a little computer language, we can program, but can I make a game with it? And everyone wanted to make a game with it. So this was Designer's Pencil 2.0 when I built in all the game capability into this language that I had created. And if I have any regrets in my career, this is a regret. That we should still be working on this title today. This title should have been a title that we updated, maintained, put out on new platforms, the way they do with Photoshop or any other big title. But that wasn't the mentality in that era. In that era, the mentality was you put it out and you move on to your next product.
And not only that, the mentality was there was really a small team, if not one man, making the game.
Right.
And this product took the entire East Coast Design Center.
For a while, yeah.
Yes.
You were involved as well, Dan, then, as well?
Oh, yeah.
I was. I had written a lot of the demos. I remember the strength of the product was amazing. I think I rewrote the entire Pitfall game using Game Maker in probably a week and a half. Wow. So Dave, it probably took 6 months on the 2600.
Yeah, I mean, it was completely different, but you could really
could create
things
games
amazingly fast.
And so I created a lot of games, and I think what some people don't know is a few of the Absolute Entertainment games on the Commodore that we published as self-running games were created with Gary's Game Maker.
Right. Wow. So I wish I had kept working on it.
We all do. We all do. I'm going to go now. You mentioned that both David and Gary, you moved on together to form Absolute, but I was quite surprised. Yeah, and Dan as well. Yeah. Well, I was intrigued with this, Dan, because I was looking for something later on, and this is published by Activision, and I believe that you were involved with this. So was there a sort of lingering connection with Activision?
Oh, there was. When we left Activision, we left on very friendly terms, and consequently, they contracted us. They contracted us at, I believe it, while it's still at Activision, I created the 2600 port of Dave's Ghostbusters game. And then after we had left, when the second film was coming out, they contracted us to do another game in the same way that we did games for other companies at that point. Atari had contracted us to do some VCS games in the later parts when I did
Right.
things like Crossbow.
So what's interesting is in the 1985 to 1987, in 1984 to 1987 range,
Right.
there were only 2 or 3 companies in the world putting out remnants of Atari games when there was a small, but it was still a market. We got a call from Toys R Us because they were in Paramus, next town from us, and we knew the buyer. And he said, you know, I got people coming in wanting Atari games. Nobody's putting them out. So we started doing games for our Absolute label. We started doing games for Activision's label, and we started doing games for
Atari's
Atari's label. We were the only developer of Atari 2600 games for a 3-year period when no one else was making them.
Right. All the kids who played it originally put it in the closet, and their younger brother or sister grew up. Their younger brother at the time and pulled it out, and there was a resurgence of desire for new titles.
Can I just say that does bring us on to that so many things that happen to you still happen in the industry now that you have that late end of a console.
Yep.
So I'm going to start. I'm going to go this way along. So Dan, I've got a the logos of the two, which look quite similar. Okay. I don't think the companies are quite similar. So I'm going to start back with you and say, Dan, what were your abiding memories of working at Activision? Any highs and maybe any lows?
I think it was just the camaraderie and the excitement of sitting down and creatively creating games that at the infancy of the video game business, we had looked upon Dave and Al and Bob and Larry as really the pioneers of creating incredible software, and to be a part of that team going in that direction, creating software in hand in hand with these guys, that was a highlight. I think one of the low points was seeing the 2600 decrease, but it was turned around very quickly by giving us the ability to be creative on new systems. And we go back to a little bit about when did we know the tide had turned. I know Dave mentioned the amount of companies at CES. I remember I was with Gary and we were driving through Paramus, New Jersey, and stopped by a Video Shack store that sold our games to walk in and see what our cartridges, how many our cartridges were there. And Gary inevitably looked and, oh my God, there was a non-Activision cartridge and a non-Atari game. And it was called Skeet Shoot. And since then we know it was done by Ed Salvo from Games by Apollo. And we got a copy of it and turned it around, and Gary looked at me and said, we're in big trouble.
Yeah, it's the end.
As you remember, Gary said, this is the end. And we looked at it, and Ed's a very nice designer, nice chap. But in the early days, he did not, he wasn't proficient on the machine. So Gary turned it over and said, look at the graphics. If we're now competing with this, and this is selling next to our games, there's going to be a lot of people doing this quality of games now that the dam is open. And inevitably, it did happen as they foresaw.
It so did. Gary, I will come to you. I pose this slightly, bold question: how to take on Atari and win. So, Gary, I want to ask you: do you think Activision did beat Atari?
Oh, well, yeah, obviously. Though the Activision of today, as big a behemoth they are, is not the same company. They're the same company in name only. They were acquired for a few $100,000 in assumption of debt out of bankruptcy by Bobby Kotick, who is absolutely brilliant. All the respect in the world for Bobby. He built an amazing software company. And Bobby was smart enough to know that the Activision brand was worth its weight in gold. But it's a different company, for sure.
One more with you then. Tell me, if you could take kind of one thing that you learned during your Activision years that you then took on for your continuing career, what would it be, Gary?
Guess there's nothing.
Well, most important thing I did out of my Activision career was Dave and I ended up collaborating, and we've worked together ever since. We still collaborate today. We can read each other's code. We think the same. Where when I first met Dave, Dave's a very hard guy to communicate with because he's usually trying to explain something, but he's explaining it at a level so much higher than other people would understand that you kind of go, like at Activision, there was a rule. The rule was a video game guy would go over to Dave and ask him a question, and he'd get an answer, and he'd walk away and go, well, that didn't help me. So then he'd go over and ask again, and he'd get a little more, and that still didn't really help me. And the answer was, if you ask 3 times, that's all you're going to get, so go figure it out on your own. But Dave and I hit it off. We learned how to exchange ideas, finish each other's sentences, and obviously with Dan as well, we built this tremendous partnership.
Absolutely.
that's
And I'm
what I
going to
took
give
out
that last word. And I will only ask once, not 3 times. What about you, David? Do you look back and think things could have been very different?
Wow, things could have been different. No, I have no regrets, nothing that we did that I would change. It's 1979. Half the people in this room weren't alive in 1979, maybe more than half. And in 1979, the video game business barely existed. I mean, think about that. There was Atari, right? Yeah. And the third-party publishing business of video game consoles did not exist. And so the legacy of Activision, is the creation of this third-party publishing business. I was at a GDC conference and asked the question, who of the 600 people in this audience work for a third-party publisher? And it's everybody. I mean, it's how it worked. And we recently had an Activision reunion, and I wanted to point out to everyone who was there that everybody in that reunion from the pre-'80s days had some effect on creating the video game business. I mean, everything from marketing and sales and distribution and manufacturing. On every side of it, people were involved. And one of the gals actually stood up and she said, Activision was my first job. And a lot of people don't realize that Activision, we had a good year, so we flew everybody to Hawaii. We took the entire company plus a significant other to Hawaii, where the first night was a fireworks display.
Yeah, that was pretty.
I mean, it was pretty.
That was
nice.
a lot of fun. Yes.
Can I say you've still got the shirt as well? So you've still kept that faith here.
And anyway, so she gets up and she's talking about her time at Atari, and she said, the biggest mistake that I made is I thought all companies were like Activision.
Yeah. That's
So
beautiful.
everybody who ever worked there at that period of time realized how special it was. And we were working our butts off and playing hard.
Well, we're on to the playing hard. We're going to finish. We won't have time for the quiz, and I'll try and get a question or two at the end. But the plan is that we were going to try and get each of them. Each of them have selected a game. We've got Dragster, which is by David. We've got Crackpots by Dan, and we've got Keystone Capers. I thought it was going to be Pressure Cooker. Oh, that's good. From there, yeah. So I'll be honest with you. I think we might only have a chance for Dragster. So, right. The idea is that Activision used to have competitions, didn't they? Right. So we're going to try and recreate it here. So, right. I'm trusting you two. So it's Dan against Gary. A little bit of sibling rivalry. While they're doing it, David, I'm going to ask you, why did you pick, of all your games, why did you pick this one?
When we finished our games, we would show them to the public the first time at CES, as we talked about.
Yeah.
Okay. And I brought the game to CES, and we have a sales meeting a couple days before CES where all the salespeople come, because it's a sales show, and all the salespeople are there, and I demonstrate the game or whatever. And there was a guy, our Chicago rep was, middle-aged, but he had a 18-year-old son who was helping him out. So he was the one who took the cartridge that night and went home. He came back the next day, and this was a very mafioso-looking family. I mean, this guy looked like he was right out of The Godfather, even the young version. And he walks up to me, grabs me by the shoulder, and he said, "I should kill you." He said, "I have not slept since I took that game home 2 nights ago." And that's what this game is. It's a 7-second game that you can play for 35 hours straight.
That was it. You were definitely onto something then.
The best 7-second game ever made.
Yes, yeah. Well, actually, ask my wife about that. Anyway, not appropriate. Okay, while the boys are doing this, we're really short of time, and we've got the Mortal Kombat panel starting. So I'm basically can I just encourage you to play Crackpots and Keystone Capers. We're not going to run out of time, boys. I'm so sorry. You can put stick Crackpots on so it's on in the background. I think we can take, I'm not joking, perhaps 2 questions. So if you'd like a question, put your hand up now. I'm so sorry. I'm going to take these 2 chaps here. So here we go. There we go. And if Crackpots is playing in the background, it's brilliant. Is it over here?
Hello, everyone. I'm Daniel, and first of all, thank you very much for all the games that you all have designed and for pioneering the industry. I was wondering, for the Atari games, what kind of computers did you program them on, and what kind of programming languages you do? Is it all like pretty much straight up assembly, or is there something else involved?
It's all 6502 assembly, 8-bit assembly. When I did the games before I joined Activision, I used my Apple II, because it was also 6502. And when I reverse engineered this machine, I did it by using the Apple II, and I created an umbilical cord that went between the Atari and the Apple. So using the Apple, I could read what was in the Atari. When we joined Activision, Dave will tell you it was a PDP-11 mini computer that we used.
But still, it was all written in assembly language. Every game up until 1990 was written in assembly language. I mean, not until, like I said, I think the PlayStation 1 did it have enough power where you could write in C. And so it was all assembly language. So really what you need to do that is a text editor where you write your source, and then an assembler where you pass the source through and it turns it into machine code. And then you download that into a device, which we called a development system, which was a ROM emulator that plugged into the video game system and let you play the latest version of the game.
And despite what people would tell you, the transition from assembly language to all games now being written in C or C+, is not a good thing, and it was not for your benefit. Because if they wrote games in assembly language, they'd be a hell of a lot better than they are now.
So thank you, Dan, for putting that other game on. You are a proper loving brother. That is really nice. Okay, I'm really sorry I've got this last question. So I met you by the pool, didn't I?
Hello, Drake. Thank you for all the great memories as a kid playing the games. What kind of panels or what was the system y'all did to come out for the scores needed to earn patches? And did y'all think that 20 plus years that the people would still want patches so bad?
Well, it was pretty arbitrary deciding what was a good score to make the patch. We would just play the games internally, and we'd say, I'd say maybe 20,000 is a good number. Really pretty arbitrary, like I said. But we loved the patches. I mean, it's really funny. Microsoft, I think, still believes that they invented achievements in video games. So that was just one of the better things that came out of those early days, no doubt.
Can I just say, we could do this for 2 hours, couldn't we? But we are on a tight schedule. But what there's definitely time for is to have a massive thank you, not only for today, but for all the hours and years of pleasure your work has given us. So let's hear it for David, Gary, and Dan.